October 15, 1982, and the Friday night lights blazed over Pearson High School's football stadium in the small Texas town of Riverside, population 8,000, where high school football was treated with the reverence usually reserved for religion. The Pearson Wildcats were playing their biggest rival, the Marshall Tigers, in a homecoming game that had the entire town packed into the stadium's bleachers, and the crisp October evening had drawn over 3,000 fans. Blake Morrison was 18 years old, a high school senior with dark brown hair worn in the feathered style popular that year, hazel eyes, and an easy confidence that made him well-liked among classmates and teachers alike. He was 6 feet tall, athletic though he didn't play football, and he wore his Letterman jacket from track team over a white Pearson Wildcats t-shirt, jeans, and Nike sneakers that were still relatively new. Blake had come to the game with his girlfriend Sarah Mitchell and their friends, sitting in the student section where they cheered for the Wildcats, who were winning 21-14 going into the fourth quarter. At halftime, Blake had bought nachos and sodas for himself and Sarah from the concession stand, and they'd watched the marching band perform while making plans to go to the post-game party at Tommy Henderson's house. The Wildcats won the game 28-21, and as the final buzzer sounded at 10:15 p.m., the crowd erupted in celebration with students rushing onto the field to congratulate players and the band playing the school fight song. Blake told Sarah around 10:25 p.m. that he needed to get something from his truck, a blue 1976 Ford F-150 he'd bought with money from his summer job at his father's construction company, parked in the student lot behind the stadium. "I'll be right back, maybe 5 minutes," Blake said, kissing Sarah on the cheek. "Meet me by the gates and we'll head to Tommy's party together." Sarah watched Blake walk away through the crowd still celebrating on the field, and she assumed he'd gone to get his jacket or maybe cigarettes he kept hidden in his truck, and she stood with friends near the main gates waiting for him. The student parking lot was approximately 200 yards from the stadium gates, accessed through a pathway that ran alongside the gymnasium building, and it was well lit with overhead lights, though somewhat isolated from the main crowd. At 10:45 p.m., when Blake hadn't returned, Sarah began to worry and asked their friend Tommy to walk with her to the parking lot to check on him, and her concern grew when they found Blake's truck still parked where it had been. The Ford F-150 was locked with no sign of Blake anywhere nearby, and Tommy checked around the truck while Sarah looked in nearby areas thinking maybe Blake had run into someone and gotten distracted. By 11 p.m., Sarah was genuinely frightened and contacted Blake's parents, who'd attended the game and were still in the parking lot preparing to leave, and within minutes a search was organized by parents and students. Blake's father, Robert Morrison, immediately checked the truck and found it locked with Blake's leather jacket, visible on the front seat through the window, and he knew something was wrong because Blake never went anywhere without that jacket. In approximately 35 minutes, while walking from a crowded football stadium to a well-lit parking lot 200 yards away, 18-year-old Blake Morrison vanished without anyone seeing or hearing what happened to him. If this case has grabbed your attention, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how this unfolds. Hit that like button and comment where you're watching from or what you think happened. Now let's continue. Riverside police were called at 11:10 p.m., and officers David Chen and Patricia Williams arrived to find over 50 people searching the school grounds, calling Blake's name and checking every building and outdoor area. The pathway between the stadium and parking lot was searched thoroughly, and officers found no signs of struggle, no dropped items, nothing that indicated Blake had been on that path recently, or that anything violent had occurred. The school buildings were all locked, and a custodian confirmed that he'd secured all doors at 9:30 p.m. before the game ended, meaning Blake couldn't have entered any structures without breaking in. Blake's truck was examined, and investigators found his leather jacket, some cassette tapes, and loose change in the console, but no wallet or keys which Blake would have been carrying with him. Sarah was interviewed extensively about Blake's state of mind and whether he'd mentioned plans to go anywhere, besides getting something from his truck, but she insisted he'd seemed completely normal and happy about the Wildcats' win. "He was excited about the party," Sarah said through tears. "He'd been talking about it all week. There's no way he'd just leave without telling me. Something happened to him between the stadium and his truck." Friends confirmed that Blake had been in good spirits all evening with no indication of problems, no arguments with anyone, nothing that would make him want to disappear or suggest he was in danger. By midnight, over 100 people were searching Riverside's downtown area and residential streets near the school, checking alleys and parks and anywhere an 18-year-old might have gone or been taken. By 1 a.m., the Riverside police had called in additional officers from surrounding towns, and the search had expanded to cover a 2-mile radius from Pearson High School, with volunteers checking businesses and vacant buildings. Police Chief Harold Thompson coordinated the effort and immediately treated Blake's disappearance as suspicious given the circumstances, because teenage boys didn't simply vanish while walking to their trucks after football games. Blake's description was broadcast on police radios across the region. 18 years old, 6 feet tall, approximately 170 pounds, brown hair, hazel eyes, wearing a white Wildcats t-shirt, blue jeans, and Nike sneakers. Investigators interviewed everyone who'd been parked near Blake's truck, asking if they'd seen him approach his vehicle or noticed anyone unusual in the parking lot during or after the game. One student named Jennifer Walsh reported seeing an unfamiliar dark-colored van parked near the back of the student lot around 10 p.m., and she'd thought it odd because it wasn't in a designated parking space. It was just sitting there with the engine running, Jennifer explained. I noticed it because you could see exhaust coming from the tailpipe, but I couldn't see anyone inside because the windows were tinted. This information sent investigators scrambling to find other witnesses who might have seen the van, and several students confirmed noticing a dark van, possibly blue or black, but nobody had noted a license plate or make. The theory emerged that Blake had been grabbed by someone waiting in or near the van, possibly forced inside while walking to his truck, and the vehicle had left before anyone realized something was wrong. But this theory struggled to explain why nobody had heard Blake yell or noticed a struggle, because the parking lot had been relatively busy with people coming and going even after the game ended. Robert Morrison insisted that Blake had no enemies and couldn't imagine anyone who'd want to harm his son, and he described Blake as responsible and well-liked with plans to attend Texas A&M the following year. Blake's mother, Linda, was inconsolable, convinced that her son had been kidnapped, and she kept asking investigators why nobody had seen or heard anything if someone had taken Blake. Sarah Mitchell was interviewed again about whether Blake had mentioned being followed or feeling threatened recently, and she said he'd never expressed any concerns about his safety or mentioned problems with anyone. The pathway between the stadium and parking lot was processed as a potential crime scene, with investigators checking for footprints and any physical evidence that might indicate what had happened to Blake. They found dozens of footprints from students who'd used the path throughout the evening, making it impossible to determine which, if any, belonged to Blake or someone who might have been following him. By Saturday morning, the search had intensified with volunteers walking fields and wooded areas surrounding the school, and bloodhounds were brought in from Dallas to track Blake's scent from the stadium. The dogs picked up a trail leading from the stadium gates toward the parking lot, but the scent ended abruptly about halfway along the pathway, with the handlers reporting the dogs seemed confused, as if the trail just stopped. This strange behavior from experienced tracking dogs troubled investigators, because it suggested either Blake had gotten into a vehicle at that point or something had happened to mask his scent. Chief Thompson organized interviews with every student and parent who'd attended the game, a massive undertaking involving over 3,000 people, and investigators asked specifically about the dark van in the parking lot. Several witnesses provided similar descriptions of the van, and a composite was created, dark-colored, possibly a Ford or Chevrolet from the late 1970s, tinted windows, no visible markings or company logos. This description matched thousands of vans in Texas, and without a license plate or more specific details, tracking down the vehicle seemed nearly impossible. Blake's bedroom was searched for any clues about his state of mind or whether he'd been planning to run away, but investigators found only typical teenage belongings and college brochures for Texas A&M. His journal entries from recent weeks showed a happy senior looking forward to graduation and college, excited about track season and his relationship with Sarah, with no indication of problems or plans to disappear. Financial records showed Blake had about $300 in his savings account from summer work, and the money hadn't been withdrawn, suggesting he hadn't left voluntarily with plans to start over somewhere. Robert Morrison appeared on local news Saturday evening pleading for information about his son, and Blake's photo was shown across Texas media outlets, a clean-cut teenager in his track Letterman jacket smiling at the camera. "Blake is a good kid with his whole life ahead of him," Robert said. "If someone has him, please let him go, and if anyone saw anything at the game Friday night, please come forward. We just want our son home." Tips began flooding in from people claiming to have seen Blake at gas stations and restaurants across Texas, but every reported sighting was investigated and found to be either mistaken identity or someone trying to help but remembering incorrectly. By Sunday, the case had generated statewide attention, with newspapers running headlines about the high school senior who'd vanished after a football game, and suddenly Blake Morrison's disappearance had captured Texas's collective concern. The FBI joined the investigation on Monday when it became clear Blake's disappearance might involve abduction across state lines, and Special Agent Marcus Webb arrived in Riverside to coordinate with local law enforcement. Agent Webb immediately focused on the dark van, believing it represented the most credible lead, and he requested that every dark-colored van registered in Texas and surrounding states be cross-referenced against owners with criminal histories. The database search identified over 15,000 vehicles matching the general description, and investigators began the massive task of tracking down owners and verifying their whereabouts on October 15th. One van owner named Gerald Patterson, who lived 40 miles from Riverside, raised immediate red flags because he had a prior conviction for assault in 1976, and investigators rushed to interview him. Patterson's van was processed forensically, and his alibi checked thoroughly, but he'd been working at a manufacturing plant with time cards proving he wasn't in Riverside during the football game, and he was eventually cleared. The theory that Blake had been taken by someone who'd been watching him specifically, perhaps stalking him before the game, was explored through interviews with students about whether they'd noticed anyone unusual around school. Several students mentioned seeing an older man, possibly in his 30s or 40s, sitting in a car near the school on multiple occasions over the previous weeks, but descriptions were too vague to be useful. Blake's friends were interviewed about his activities and relationships, and they painted a picture of a typical popular senior. He played track, had a steady girlfriend, worked weekends for his father, and was looking forward to college. Nobody could identify any conflicts or problems that would make Blake a target, and his relationship with Sarah was described as healthy and stable, with no jealousy or drama from ex-boyfriends or rejected admirers. The possibility that Blake had been the victim of a random opportunistic crime was considered, someone who'd been at the game and had seen a chance to grab a teenager who was alone. But this theory struggled to explain how such a crime could be executed in a relatively public space without witnesses, and why the perpetrator would risk grabbing someone at a crowded event rather than a more isolated location. By November, the intensive search had been scaled back to weekend volunteer efforts, and investigators acknowledged they had no solid leads, despite interviewing thousands of people and following up on hundreds of tips. The dark van was never identified despite the massive effort to track down matching vehicles, and investigators began to suspect the description might be inaccurate, or the van had come from outside the immediate region. Blake's parents hired private investigators in early 1983 to conduct an independent review of the case, hoping fresh perspective might reveal something police had missed. The private investigators retraced Blake's likely path from the stadium to the parking lot dozens of times, timing how long it would take and looking for places where someone could have grabbed him without being seen. They identified a blind spot near the gymnasium building where the pathway curved, and temporary storage containers blocked views from both the stadium and parking lot, creating a 15-second window where someone could act without witnesses. This area was re-examined forensically, but months of weather and foot traffic had erased any evidence that might have existed immediately after Blake's disappearance. Sarah Mitchell struggled with severe guilt, believing she should have gone with Blake to his truck or insisted he wait until after they'd gone to the party, and she required therapy to cope with the trauma. She told investigators repeatedly about Blake's final words, analyzing them for any hidden meaning or clue she might have missed, but "I'll be right back, maybe 5 minutes," offered nothing that explained what had happened. The post-game party at Tommy Henderson's house had gone ahead despite Blake's disappearance, though the mood had been somber, and investigators interviewed everyone who'd been there looking for anyone who seemed suspiciously unconcerned. But all of Blake's friends had been genuinely distraught about his disappearance, and none raised suspicions or had motives for harming him or making him disappear. The case was featured on local Texas television programs throughout 1983, generating periodic surges of tips that investigators followed up on, but each lead dissolved into nothing, just like all the ones before. One particularly disturbing tip came from a woman who claimed she'd seen a teenager matching Blake's description being forced into a van at a truck stop near Houston, but investigation revealed the incident had occurred weeks after Blake's disappearance. By 1985, the case had gone cold with periodic reviews but no active investigation, and Blake Morrison became one of dozens of Texas teenagers who'd vanished in the 1980s under mysterious circumstances. Robert Morrison became involved with missing persons advocacy groups and pushed for better security at high school events, channeling his grief into activism that might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Linda Morrison never recovered emotionally from losing Blake, developing severe depression that required medication and regular therapy, and she spent hours each day looking at Blake's photos and wondering where he was. The blue Ford F-150 remained parked in the Morrison driveway for years, covered with a tarp, because Robert couldn't bring himself to sell it or drive it, and it sat as a monument to the son who'd never returned. Blake's Letterman jacket stayed in the truck where he'd left it that October night, and sometimes Sarah would visit and sit in the truck remembering the boy she'd loved and the future they'd planned together. The years passed with agonizing slowness for the Morrison family, with 1982 becoming 1990 and then 2000, and Blake's bedroom remained frozen in time as if the 18-year-old might walk through the door at any moment. Age progression photos were created showing what Blake might look like at 25, then 35, then 45, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases and featured on websites dedicated to unsolved disappearances. Robert Morrison spent thousands of hours over the decades reviewing the case file and investigating leads that police had dismissed or hadn't pursued thoroughly, unable to accept that his son had vanished without explanation. He tracked down and interviewed former students who'd been at the game, showing them photos of Blake and asking if they remembered seeing anything unusual in the parking lot or along the pathway. Most had vague memories of that October night and could add nothing new to the investigation, though several mentioned they'd been haunted for years by the fact that someone had been taken from their midst. Linda Morrison died in 2004 at age 63 from heart failure that doctors attributed to decades of unrelenting stress and grief, and she was buried holding a photo of Blake from his senior portrait. Detective James Carson took over the cold case in 2008 when he joined Riverside Police, and he approached it with modern investigative techniques including DNA databases and enhanced forensic analysis that hadn't existed in 1982. But the case presented unique challenges because there had been no physical evidence collected, no crime scene to process, no items that could be tested for DNA or fingerprints that might identify a suspect. Carson interviewed elderly residents who'd lived in Riverside in 1982, asking if they remembered anything unusual during that time period or had heard rumors about Blake's disappearance that were never reported to police. One retired teacher named Margaret Ellis mentioned that she'd heard whispers years ago about a student who'd been jealous of Blake's relationship with Sarah, but she couldn't remember names or whether the rumor had any basis. This lead was investigated extensively, with Carson reviewing yearbooks and interviewing former students about romantic rivalries or jealousies involving Blake, but nothing credible emerged from the effort. By 2015, Blake would have been 51 years old, possibly with a career and family if he'd survived, and the idea that he might be alive somewhere living under a different identity seemed statistically impossible. True crime podcasts discovered Blake's case in the 2010s, and several shows featured detailed episodes analyzing the evidence and proposing theories about what might have happened in that parking lot. Some podcasters suggested Blake had been taken by a serial predator who targeted teenagers at public events, someone who understood crowd dynamics and knew how to grab victims in moments when nobody was watching. Investigators looked for connections to other missing teenagers from Texas high school events in the 1980s, and they found several cases with similar circumstances, though none that could definitively be linked. The most persistent theory remained that Blake had been grabbed by someone in or near the dark van, possibly someone who'd been watching him specifically, or who'd seen an opportunity and acted impulsively. But identifying who might have done this proved impossible without the van being located or a witness coming forward with more specific information after decades of silence. Sarah Mitchell, who'd married someone else in 1987 and had 2 children, still kept Blake's senior photo in a drawer, and she told her husband that her first love had been the boy who disappeared from a football game. She occasionally searched online databases for any mention of Blake or updates on his case, and each year on October 15th, she visited the Pearson High School parking lot and stood where his truck had been parked. Robert Morrison continued searching until his death in 2019 at age 78, and his final words to family were reportedly, "Tell Blake I never stopped looking for him and I'll see him soon." His obituary mentioned that he was survived by his missing son Blake, whose disappearance in 1982 had defined the rest of Robert's life and driven his decades of investigation. The blue Ford F-150 was finally sold in 2020 when the Morrison estate was settled, and the new owner had no idea the truck had belonged to a teenager who'd vanished after a football game 38 years earlier. Blake's case file at Riverside Police Department had grown to thousands of pages over the decades, documenting every tip investigated, every theory explored, every dead end encountered in the quest for answers. Detective Morrison reviewed the case periodically until his retirement in 2022, and he admitted in interviews that Blake's disappearance remained the most frustrating case he'd ever worked, because nothing about it made logical sense. A popular kid doesn't vanish from a crowded school event without someone seeing something, Morrison said. Either witnesses didn't realize what they saw was important, or someone has kept quiet for 40 years, and I don't know which possibility is more disturbing. The pathway between the stadium and parking lot at Pearson High School has been renovated several times over the decades, with improved lighting and security cameras installed in the 1990s to prevent future incidents. But these improvements came too late for Blake Morrison, who'd walked that path in 1982, when security consisted of overhead lights and the assumption that teenagers were safe at their own school events. Former classmates who are now in their late 50s occasionally post on social media about Blake, remembering the friend who disappeared and expressing continued frustration that nobody has ever been held accountable. By 2024, Blake Morrison's disappearance has become one of Texas's most haunting unsolved cases, discussed in true crime forums and studied by investigators trying to understand how someone could vanish from a crowded high school event. The image of Blake in his track Letterman jacket smiling confidently in his senior portrait has been shared thousands of times across social media by people fascinated by the teenager who walked to his truck and was never seen again. Sarah, now in her 60s and widowed, keeps that senior portrait in her home office, and she told a podcast interviewer in 2023 that not a day passes when she doesn't wonder what happened to Blake. "I've lived an entire life without knowing," Sarah said. "I raised children, had a career, grew old, and through it all I've carried this weight of not knowing if Blake is dead or alive, if he suffered, or if it was quick." The Riverside Police Department maintains Blake's case in their cold case files, and his information is cross-referenced whenever unidentified remains are discovered in Texas or when similar disappearances occur. But 42 years have passed without a single confirmed sighting or piece of physical evidence emerging, and the statistical likelihood that Blake is still alive has diminished to essentially zero. Detective Amanda Chen was assigned to review the case in 2023 using modern technology, and she used social media to track down former Pearson High School students, asking if anyone remembered details they hadn't shared in 1982. Several people responded with memories of that October night, the excitement of the homecoming win followed by the growing horror, as word spread that Blake Morrison was missing and couldn't be found anywhere. But none of these memories produced new investigative leads, only confirmation that hundreds of people had been present, yet nobody had witnessed what happened to Blake during those critical minutes. The dark van that multiple witnesses reported seeing has never been identified, despite being one of the most sought vehicles in Texas missing persons history, and its existence remains the case's most frustrating unsolved element. Some investigators now believe the van description might have been inaccurate or misremembered, possibly conflating different vehicles seen at different times, though this doesn't explain the consistency among multiple witness accounts. The theory that Blake was grabbed by someone who'd been specifically targeting him remains plausible but impossible to prove without identifying a suspect who had motive and opportunity. Another theory suggests Blake witnessed something criminal in the parking lot, perhaps a drug transaction or assault, and was eliminated by people who couldn't risk him reporting what he'd seen. But no evidence of criminal activity at Pearson High School that night was ever found, and this theory exists only as speculation without supporting facts. The most statistically likely explanation remains abduction by someone in or connected to the dark van, but 42 years of investigation has failed to identify the vehicle or its occupants. Pearson High School holds a memorial event every October 15th for Blake, and current students are taught about the senior who disappeared as part of safety education, about being aware of surroundings. The parking lot where Blake's truck was found has been completely redesigned over the decades, with modern lighting and security cameras that would have captured evidence if the disappearance had occurred in the current era. But in 1982, security technology was limited, and whatever happened to Blake occurred in an environment where crimes could be committed with less risk of being recorded or witnessed. True crime communities continue to debate the case online, proposing theories ranging from serial predator to witness elimination to voluntary disappearance. But none can account for all the evidence and Blake's character. Former classmates who knew Blake insist he would never have voluntarily disappeared, that he had too much to live for, and was too considerate to put his family through decades of anguish. The case stands as a reminder that even in seemingly safe environments like high school football games, predators can operate if they choose their moment carefully and understand how to exploit brief windows of opportunity. And it highlights how quickly someone can vanish when circumstances align, when a crowded event creates just enough distraction for something terrible to happen without witnesses. Sarah visits Blake's grave marker in Riverside Cemetery, a memorial stone erected by his parents even though there's no body buried there, and she places flowers every October 15th. The inscription reads, Blake Morrison, 1964-1982. Beloved son and friend, gone but never forgotten, may you find peace wherever you are, acknowledging that he likely died that October night. And in case files and databases and the hearts of people who knew him, Blake exists as both a real teenager who had dreams and a future ahead of him, and as a symbol of how completely someone can disappear. The last confirmed sighting shows Blake walking away from Sarah through the celebrating crowd after the Wildcats' victory, heading toward his truck with no idea he would never reach it or be seen again. And somewhere in Texas, or in memories someone has kept hidden for 42 years, or in a place no investigator has yet considered, the answer to what happened to Blake Morrison may still exist. But until that answer emerges, if it ever does, Blake remains among the missing. His disappearance an enduring mystery that challenges our understanding of how evil can strike in crowded places. Detective Chen believes someone who was at that game knows something they've never shared, either because they were involved or because they saw something they didn't recognize as significant until years later when it was too late. 3,000 people were there that night, Chen says. Someone saw something, someone knows something, and I hope they come forward before everyone who might have answers is gone, and the truth dies with them. But the Texas night offers no answers, and the mystery of what happened to Blake Morrison after a Friday football game in 1982 remains unsolved to this day. The pathway between the stadium and parking lot where Blake was last seen has been walked by thousands of students over the decades, and most have no idea they're following the same route a senior took 42 years ago. And every Friday night when lights blaze over Texas high school football stadiums, someone inevitably remembers the teenager who went to get something from his truck and never came back, his fate a mystery that has endured for over 4 decades. The blue Ford F-150 that sat as a monument in the Morrison driveway for years is gone now, sold to someone who drives it unaware of its connection to one of Texas's most baffling disappearances. But Blake Morrison's memory persists in the people who loved him and in the cold case files that document 42 years of searching without finding the answers that would bring closure. And in the vast Texas landscape, somewhere in the thousands of square miles between cities and towns, the secret of what happened to Blake Morrison on October 15th, 1982, may still be waiting to be discovered.